Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we delve into a new category of thought called Alt-Wallah within the Islamicate, based around a supposed crisis of masculinity, the alt-right and Muslim men. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, Dr. Haiza Mir and Hussein Kesvani explore this topic and the prevailing belief in some online communities of Muslim men that Muslim masculinity is in decline and in need of urgent support.
A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Yusra Samir Imran, and I'm your chair for this event titled Alt-Wallah's the Muslim Manosphere. When we talk about the Muslim Manosphere, we're talking about a group of Muslim men who believe that the traditional roles of men and women are threatened and are in crisis, and that there is a decline in civilization. Usually they attribute this to sort of Western morals and Western civilization being the reason for this decline. And also they attribute this to the rise of feminism, and in particular, strands of feminism called Muslim feminism, so Muslim feminists. As a result of this, they have aligned themselves with other alt-right movements, including those who have historically actually been anti-Islam and who have viewed Muslims as being a danger and a threat to society. So there's this sort of political alignment that has taken place as a result. So, as I mentioned, there are loads of terms being thrown about at the moment in this debate about a Muslim manosphere or sort of toxic masculinity within the Muslim community. So we've got mincels or Muslim incels, the Akhirite, the Muslim alt-right, and the Muslim red pill movement. Why is terminology important? And I'm going to start with you, Hizr.
Names matter. Yeah? And I think the reason why names matter is names allow you to name something, and they allow you to see where it is in the world, how it exists in the world. And the reason why we kind of looked at different names, such as mincel, such as Akhirite, but the reason why we looked at these and then disregarded them was, for example, mincels. The incel movement has a very specific set of nodes in their discourse. And it was weird to us that we were describing people as mincels who were happily married. We don't know, but they were married. So this seems a bit weird. You're calling these incels, and yet they're married. They're not involuntary celibate, which is what the incel is shortened, or is a shortened form for. So this kind of interrogation of what are we actually naming, how are we naming it, why are we naming it thus, was quite important. And so in conjunction with my co-author, what we did was we thought about, well, how is Islam used by those who we call the Alt-Wallahs? And we settled after, even in the article, we kind of go through some of our reasoning where we thought we were going to use Islamo-nationalism, but then I think that was too close to Islamofascism. So yeah, that's kind of why we thought names were important.
So Hussein, sort of drawing back to your chapter in Follow Me Akhi, where you specifically zoom in on the Muslim manosphere and on sort of alt-right Muslim movements. You mentioned that many sort of Muslim dawah influencers did not like to use the term Muslim red pill movement. So why do you think that, on one hand, it seemed as if that they were apologists, you know, towards these alt-right movements, towards the red pill movement, but they didn't want to be singled out? They sort of rejected that terminology.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's really interesting because when I was writing this in 2019, it felt like this was really just kind of beginning to emerge. And the original chapter of it was a lot longer than it came out to be. And part of the reason why we shortened it down was because my editor wasn't entirely convinced that I was kind of saying that, yeah, this is kind of one potential future. And she was like, oh, like maybe not. And now I look back and I was like, well, I was right, which was nice. And we talk about it quite a lot in terms of how at the time it was sort of seen as this kind of niche. But I think they were very hesitant. And part of it was because a lot of the elements of red pill online culture at the time was quite Islamophobic, as well as this sort of being quite anti-immigrant anyway, right? And so their sort of settlement was really this idea. And because like a lot of the kind of red pill guys had kind of come out in favor of like Donald Trump, and they had sort of come out in favor of other sort of kind of fringe American right-wing characters who part of their sort of support for this movement came from like an anti-Muslim sentiment and by extension an anti-immigration sentiment. And so I think they were wary about sort of placing like kind of, or making like formal allyship with people who had established themselves as kind of a red pill movement. So that was like one argument. The other part was that they sort of considered the red pill movement to be a secular one. So they were sort of looking at kind of incels, and they were looking at kind of the MGTOWs, the men going their own way. There are lots of other sort of like subsections of these groups. And what they were saying is that, well, these men are kind of annoyed that they can't have sex with women, like, you know, but they're not talking about marriage. They're not talking about kind of, you know, religious marriage in particular. And so the Muslims can't ally in a direct way because what they're searching for is kind of like casual intimacy, which is something that they kind of considered Islam to be antithetical to. You know, there's a writer that I was talking to at a conference a few weeks ago who's basically trying to do a version of my book, but for British Sikhs. And we were talking about how actually like the things that I was identifying back in like 2017, 18 are very evident in the Sikh community as well. And the same types of crises emerge, the same types of influences who basically say the same thing. It's like, well, you know, the Gita sort of like says these things where so we can make these allyships with kind of secular, you know, movements in particular ways that don't necessarily endorse them.
So what I find interesting, Hussein, is that, as you mentioned, you did a lot of your field work back in like 2017, and even in the book you mentioned, it goes as far back as 2016.
Yeah.
So that's like 7 years ago now.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah.
So you were able to identify that as an emerging phenomenon online 7 years ago.
Yeah.
But why is it that it's only really pretty much been in the last year, maximum 2 years, that this has been this has become a widespread topic of debate, especially online, especially on social media? Like, what was the catalyst for it to blow up into such a big topic?
Part is the stuff that you sort of mentioned, like we have like influencers who are kind of endorsing Islam in particular ways. So obviously, like, you know, you had Tate and his conversion. Before that, you had Jordan Peterson, who, like, while like not kind of necessarily sort of being supportive of Islam, at least like endorsing some of its kind of core tenets, and then by extension endorsing the idea of like organized Abrahamic religions and so on. And I think that sort of gave credence to, you know, the idea that like, it almost gave us kind of like, not a legitimacy is not the right word, but I think for influencers who sort of felt that Islam had kind of been maligned for a long time, this kind of big internet influence is sort of saying that, oh, like a lot of the things in the Quran are actually like really good, like that sort of gave them, it kind of almost sort of changed the perspectives a little bit. So I think influencers are obviously like one catalyst. I think the other part, I was thinking about this on the train like into Bradford today, was just like when I was doing my fieldwork in like the late 2010s, you know, I did it, part of the reason why I wanted to write the book was because I was really thinking about how young Muslims are sort of using the internet to sort of negotiate and construct identities that they couldn't do in the offline world. And part of that was because the sort of structures and institutions in the offline world were kind of like, you know, were sort of built very heavy, like there would be kind of very heavy surveillance systems, where there's now like a crisis in whether that is even a system that Westerners, Western liberal, secular people actually want. I think that kind of seems to be the sort of catalyst, right? And it seems to be the place where, you know, as people lose faith in that institution, and they sort of, you know, and some of them turn to kind of conservative forms of religion, like these, you know, not even red pill Muslim influences just by themselves, but like conservative Muslim influences generally kind of see an opportunity to present Islam as kind of being a kind of solution. And so I think that's kind of where we've seen the acceleration of it. Although, again, that's like a very like simplistic thing, and I'd be interested to see like if there's any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just want to jump off of what Hussein was saying, and this was actually something we were discussing before we came here. I'm kind of jumping onto what I'm hopefully, inshallah, planning on doing next, is looking at this phenomenon of Islamophilia, where you mentioned about, certain figures, influencers, red pill influencers, endorsing certain parts of Islam, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, not necessarily converting like Tay has done, but, kind of showing a leniency which wasn't there before.
Pretty much within all these different alliances, their key area of concern and interest seems to be Muslim women. So with the alt-right Muslim men, they're policing Muslim women and the way in which they believe their roles should be, the way that they should behave and dress. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got white femo-nationalists or white feminists and the alt-right Christian movements who believe that Muslim women need saving.
The group that I want to focus on, who I believe were the precursors of the Alt-Wallahs, are those who I call fundamentalist declinists. And they argue that the decline started with the onset of modernity. Now, different scholars give different dates to this, some 1492, some with a more Muslim focus, 1798, when Napoleon invaded Egypt. I subscribe to the latter view. So they would argue that that's when decline starts. And for them, initially, the marker of decline was the marker of what they called traditional Islam. And they argued a variety of things had caused this: postmodernism, Wahhabis, those they called deconstructionists, even Marxists, all sorts. And then we got to a point where the figure of the feminist took over that role. And that's why now you see Muslim women being focused on because of the feminist. And that's basically it, that the reason why the world is as it is because of the feminist. The feminist has destroyed the family structure, which has led to a domino effect, which has basically collapsed society. And that's why I would argue that the Muslim woman especially has become the focus of the Alt-Wallah attentions in particular.
Yeah, it reflects something bigger as well, which is that in even like the secular red pill spaces, but in other like religious red pill manosphere spaces, like the similar sort of fixation on like the role of women and the sort of particular ire towards like feminism or anyone sort of perceived to be a feminist is kind of very intrinsic to at least this kind of iteration, and I think what you were sort of saying about the sort of perception of the decline in like the nuclear family, I guess by extension also this sort of the construction of what is perceived to be like tradition. I think a lot of this is also rooted in, it's not quite like nostalgia, but I don't know like whether there's like a better term for it, but there's sort of like fantasization almost of a traditional environment in which everything sort of functioned properly, and how like nefarious corrupting forces external to that are preventing this from happening, and that this is sort of kind of being done deliberately.
I think the starting point for everything in the Muslim manosphere is the loss of something called traditional Islam, of authentic Islam. And the breakdown of the nuclear family, of the traditional family, is a result of the loss of traditional Islam, of authentic Islam, which places men as Qawwamuna, guardians of women. Yeah? So even there, you've got that religious aspect. I'm not sure I agree with the religious secular split. I would, especially for the Muslim manosphere, and especially looking at people like Hakika Jao, Nabil Aziz, even Gabriele Romani, when he critiqued Mufti Menk for knitting, you're feminizing Muslim men, he did so from the perspective of hadith, that, teach your sons archery, horse riding, swimming. So this is done from the religious aspect is there first, and from there, everything else comes about. It's like when you flick one domino and the rest fall.
So if these men in the Muslim manosphere take a traditional approach and only want to take the Quran and the Sunnah, their idea, their definition of traditional masculinity is at odds with the Prophet Muhammad and the way he actually behaved.
Okay, there's a number of things that are intersecting here. It's like a knot. I'm trying to figure out which string to pull on first. I think when I would say anybody, to be honest, says that they're a traditionalist or from the tradition, I think they only mean a particular part of the tradition, because our tradition is so wide and so vast that that would mean you agree with competing claims to truth, which then is ridiculous, basically. You'd be agreeing with Ibn Sina and then Al-Ghazali's critique of Ibn Sina at the same time, so it's a nonsense, really. So then it becomes a question of trying to mine, okay, what tradition are you referring to? Which tradition is your authentic Islam? And as myself and Sarah said in the article, there's nothing written on this. I think the wider question is who is actually qualified to speak, who is actually qualified to say what Islam is. And I don't think I can answer that right now. I think that's just going to be an ongoing debate forever, I think, simply because Islam isn't Christianity. We don't have a priest class. We don't have a pope. And that debate will rage forever, I think, as it has done, up until now, even.
Wasn't that something, Hussein, you also faced, because you mentioned it in that chapter in your book, where as part of your research, you're attending these sort of, was it like these online Muslim marriage courses, was it, run by Muslim men? Was it something like that?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
And then someone told you that basically you were like not masculine, like you weren't masculine enough.
Yeah, I went to like Nabil Aziz's like Manosphere workshop, but it was a really interesting experience. Yeah, well, I sort of wanted to touch on, because I think that you're right in the sense that, and your explanation of it, I think, is really sort of noble endeavor, because you're trying to like take their claims to tradition seriously. I've always sort of felt that this claim to tradition has kind of been like, in a lot of ways, like an aesthetic claim rather than one that is necessarily like ideologically coherent. And I think that's very much the case in like the Muslim manosphere as well. Like, I haven't come across like any Muslim women who would refer to themselves as trad wives. I'm really interested if anyone else has found that out, because like, you know, I'm just intrigued in that space. But the sort of Muslim men who are seeking traditional wives and traditional marriages, also like in the form of like, these are also content creators. And so I think it's very funny to like be a content guy and like sort of wanting to kind of claim that you want to relive like or you want to sort of like live as close to sort of, you know, the classic Sahaba as possible. Like, to me, this doesn't make any sense, but again, it's very much like, no, what you're doing is trying to like sell and promote an aesthetic, which is very much part of like being part and parcel of being an influencer. To kind of also touch on something else, like the claim to authority was something I saw a lot when I was writing my book. And in particular, it was this, you know, kind of the undercurrent of the book is the idea that, you know, you have Muslims who are either disenchanted with their mosque leadership, or in their offline religious environments, they are dissatisfied. And so they go online to sort of like seek authorities of their own, and in people like Muhammad Hijab, who was just sort of a dawah guy, and who was not nearly as kind of explosive and provocative as he is now when I met him, realizing that, oh, if I'm able to sort of perform in particular ways, I can attract like a much broader audience. And as a result, we see him now kind of almost being treated as this authority, despite the fact that he doesn't really have any kind of claim to be. He would dispute that by saying that he has like lots of degrees and stuff, but like, you know, that's a conversation for a different type of panel. But there have been other people who have also sort of taken that route, right? Like they've used their charisma and they've used their ability to kind of create an aesthetic to present themselves as an authority. And in an online environment and on platforms that sell themselves by kind of saying that like, oh, you know, you don't need to sort of have like particular forms of education. You don't need to have like particular types of formal like knowledge. Like if you're able to sort of like perform well on these platforms and develop an audience, you naturally become an authority. And again, you can monetize that authority, right? So like the ways in which authority is understood in the digital age is something that is probably worth considering when we think about even these broader questions about who gets to speak for Islam. Because as you've mentioned, like this is a question that has sort of permeated, you know, for as long as kind of like religious debates have existed. And certainly when I was doing my research, you know, they sort of say that, well, we have kind of authorities who have studied in like Al-Azhar and like have studied in like the Islamic University of Medina. And so it's almost differentiating in the sense of it reacts to people saying, well, why does this Dawah guy who gets this thousands of views on YouTube, why does he get to be considered an authority? He can say, well, actually, no, I have a teacher who like has this type of position. And so like the degrees of separation are like less for me than they are for other people. But I kind of think that's more of like an insurance than an actual reasoning, right? ultimately, like, his popularity, which he's very well aware of, comes from the fact that, like, he has been able to sort of present himself as an online celebrity, in part because, like, being able to perform well in an environment like Speaker's Corner can kind of accrue an audience that will sort of give you the benefit of the doubt in most cases.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for listening. The 2024 Bradford Literature Festival starts on the 28th of June and runs for 10 days with a huge programme of events. From comedy to crime, music to memoirs. Head to bradfordlitfest.co.uk to book your tickets now.